when I think about restarts, I think a little bit about just energy. Energy is not created, it's not destroyed, but it changes shape, it changes form. And there are times when we need to remember that the energy of the gospel, the energy of the kingdom is not being created or destroyed, but it may just need to change forms for a new season. And restarting is allowing God to do something new.
Welcome to Real Faith, Real World, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. This podcast is a resource of World Methodist Evangelism, where we connect, equip, and encourage networks of Christian leaders to build faith-sharing movements around the world. My name is Rob Haynes. Thank you for listening, and I also want to express our appreciation of the folks at Christ Church Memphis for the continued support of this podcast. Today we continue our series on Innovating Church, and now we focus on church restarts. Maybe you know of, or even you've been a part of a church that struggles, whether that be with resourcing or with people or with better reflecting the needs of their own community. We talked with Dan Turner, who is a leader in the Church of God Anderson and located in Washington, D.C., and we speak with Tim Fox, who is the district superintendent of the South Coastal District in the Wesleyan Church. Dan Turner and Tim Fox, welcome to the Real Faith, Real World podcast.
Hey, Rob, thanks so much. It's so good to be with you. I've been listening to your Innovating Church series and glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, indeed. It is good to be with you guys. Big fans of both of you and love what you do and excited to have a conversation today.
Well, thank you. And as you said, Dan, we are in the midst of a series on Innovating Church. And today we're talking to you all about church restarts, which I think is a really fascinating topic. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. But first, we'd love to get to know you a little bit. Dan, tell us about yourself.
I've been here in D.C. for 18 years, which when I say that, I can hardly believe I'm saying those words. But we came to a really small church of about 30 people and restarted in 2006. I think when you searched, and Tim will appreciate this, when you searched restart or Googled it in 2006 or 2005, I think 2 links popped up at the time. So there was hardly anything there. So glad to see that more people are hearing about it and thankful for the chance to even talk about it today. I'm originally from North Carolina. Most people will stop me and say, okay, where's that accent from? Grew up in the northwest mountainous part of North Carolina before I came up to the D.C. area. We have 3 kids here in this that live here just right outside of D.C. in Tacoma Park, Maryland. My 13-year-old daughter has her first middle school soccer game today, so I'm excited for her. Our middle child is Jackson, is 7 years old. He's a special needs guy that I love an awful lot, that loves playing with his construction trucks. And then my youngest daughter, Phoebe, she loves to play hair salon in the mornings as we get her ready. She's 6 years old. My wife is a school teacher too, so somehow we've avoided getting COVID, even though I have people in 4 different schools.
Oh my word, yeah. Well, welcome to the show. We're really pleased to have you today. And Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am currently serving as the district superintendent for the South Coastal District of the Wesleyan Church. So we serve churches in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. And prior to that, I was in Goldsboro, North Carolina, also from North Carolina. It must be something innovative brewing out of North Carolina. And there we led a church to close and restart in 2013. Again, like Dan was saying, there weren't examples to follow, weren't people doing it. We didn't know each other till years later, where we led that church for about 9 years and started helping other small churches and those looking at restarts a little bit, and came into this role where we get to help churches figure out what's next, and oftentimes that does include the option of restarting and how to make that work.
Yeah.
We have 2 kids, Noah and Sophia, 15 and 13, and they love the Atlanta area. My wife partners with me in a lot of this and has been with us in the ministry in North Carolina and then helping with serving churches here now.
Well, I really appreciate the richness that you both bring. Dan, yours more from more recently and still actively in the local church, and Tim, yours from more of a shepherding role as a district superintendent, where you're helping resource pastors and doing that more, even sometimes administratively, but also shepherding and carefully in this. So I wonder if we could start with you first, Dan. Before we get too deep into how you do a church restart, let's talk about why we do a church restart. What's the problem? Why do we even need to do a restart? Why can't we just get more people into the church we already have? Why restart one?
Yeah, and I should add to my background that this work is kind of expanded because the need is huge right now. So a friend of mine and I wrote a book, and it's opened up lots of doors. So I've been able to coach. I think I'm at about 12 churches through restarts, and several more coming this year. But the need is enormous. I was just talking to a denominational leader this week who said it's bubbling up, that we have tons of churches who are months or years away from closure.
Yeah.
Rob, the statistics are pretty bleak. 4,000, they're saying maybe as many as 10,000 churches may close in 2023 after the pandemic.
Next year, that's 1 year you're talking about.
One year. The
4 to
normal
10,000.
is somewhere between 4 to 4,500, according to Lifeway Research.
Wow.
But everything I'm hearing is that is accelerating during the pandemic. In fact, some research that came out of a Lilly-funded grant that they believe churches are probably going to hit the wall 3 to 5 years earlier because of the pandemic. Churches that were already really struggling. So the need is huge, and then denominations are trying to figure out what are we going to do with all these church buildings that are empty.
Right.
What are we going to do in terms of, they had a church planting plan, but a lot of denominations don't have a plan for congregations that are just at that stage of desperation where they don't know what to do.
Yeah. So this whole idea is then a church that is dying or will die will shut down and then restart into a new church. Is that right? Can you kind of walk us through just what we're talking about, Tim, when we say a restart?
Yeah, I think you hit on the key point. A restart or a replant, whatever you call it, it has to involve the death of the church as it exists now. As he pointed out, that COVID just escalated the decline of declining churches. And there's already, you saw a great number of churches with 6, 7, 8, 10 years in stagnation or decline. And at that point, you've refused deep change so long that you've chosen a slow death. And the only way to really turn it around is to stop and have a funeral and begin something new. And I think it's a really biblical idea. I mean, you have this concept of death and resurrection, and new life only comes after death all throughout Scripture. You even see as Israel is about to pass into the promised land, and God is speaking to Joshua that he just says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you go. And at times we struggle to let things go, but it is exactly that. It's a recognition of where the church is at, and that its best option is to stop and close, go dark, regroup around new vision and strategy and with a new evangelism and discipleship focus, and restart, relaunch, replant as a brand new church as you hold on to this remnant and the new folks.
Dan, can you speak to that a little bit? Because it sounds a little harsh. I mean, why can't we just, keep loving all of the people that have been there forever and respect all of the brass plaques that are on all of the furniture and all those people? Can you speak to what Tim's talking about there a little bit?
Yeah, there's an old gospel bluegrass song that says everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I'm coaching churches, that's where the questions hit, and I know Tim's fielded those as well. They want the resurrection. They don't want the death that's involved in the midst of that. That's by far the hardest piece to stomach. But unless something dies, there's that imagery of the grain of wheat falling into the ground. Unless something dies, new life is not going to emerge.
Yeah.
To put it in more just practical terms, if a church has been doing the same thing for decades, they're not going to get different results without something drastic happen. And I think churches reach a point of no return where they're too far down, too far down the life cycle curve, so that simple change is not going to do it. And if they tried to do all of the change that was required, I don't think the leader would survive that. And Tim's walked through this, and he knows the pain, and I know the pain of it. And I don't think the congregation would survive all the changes that are needed. And so we're talking about a really drastic, radical step. I try to talk churches out of it unless they absolutely have to do a restart. But I want to clarify one thing.
Yeah.
This isn't about keeping the doors of churches open. That is not a compelling mission even for me as I do this work. It's interesting. The churches that I've interviewed, I did my dissertation work in this area. I kept hearing a phrase over and over again. I asked them to describe their driving mission as a church before restart, and they all said the same thing. We're just trying to keep the doors open. That was our mission.
Wow.
So the mission and the reason I stay involved in this work is not to keep the doors of churches open. It's so that the kingdom will expand in their communities, that church will catch a new dream, a new vision, and that they'll start having a renewed impact right where God's put them.
Because it's very different than just keeping it open because this is what we've always done, or my grandparents went here, or I want my grandkids to come. You're talking about something very, very different than an idea of keeping it the way I've always had it or going back to the way it was before. So how do you push them in that new direction, Dan?
Oh, there's where the hours are involved. So somebody asked me this week, how many conversations, how many hours do you spend with leaders before they finally make the decision to move forward? And it's months. It is months.
Right.
Unless, and Tim is a healthy district leader that he starts those conversations before I get involved, and it makes them shorter. But from beginning to end, it's usually 6 to 8 months of conversations with leaders and boards. They have to hear the stories of other churches. They have to see that there's hope. And we're talking about churches that are just beat down in their self-esteem. Like they haven't seen a win in so long. They just don't think they can do it. There's no life left. And part of what I'm saying is, look, others are doing it. And I try to speak into them and say, I see hope. You've got these resources. You have enough life left in you so that if you make a hard decision, I think God could do something really special in this place.
Yeah.
So, Rob, it's a little bit of the carrot and the stick involved in this process. Tim has to walk in and give them the hard news that unless something changes as a district leader, he's saying these things, unless something changes, you're going to have to close this building. I come in and say, I get to be the good guy. I'm going to bring you some resources and pull some partners around you, but they need both. They need both realities.
Yeah. So, Tim, to that, as a denominational leader, if I'm looking at, say, my own health stats, I know what's normal for blood pressure and, heart rate and all that kind of stuff. What are the vital signs that you're looking for in a church to know whether, hey, this is a healthy church and we need to put some resources this way, this church needs some revitalization, or this one actually needs a restart? Give us some guidance on that.
Some of it is subjective, and you can see who's there and what's possible in a place. And then there really are it's a recognition that this is not a problem that just happened, right? The moment we decide not to make a needed deep change, we choose a slow death. And those choices began usually 20 or 30 years ago by the time I'm entering into the conversation these days. And it's at a point of desperation. So often these conversations come out of a place of we know we're about to close. Is there any option for us? When I can cut it off a little earlier, it's to say, okay, this place still has some resources with some new vision and new direction and some new leadership. I think we could do something. I think God could do something remarkable here. But you start to look at things like even just critical mass in the room. So the size of a building actually has some effect on this. If a church building only seats 100, it doesn't take nearly as many people to get critical mass, get something moving again. But if it seats 300, it takes a lot more people. And so recognizing, do they have critical mass? Is there any outward focus in their ministry? Are all of their resources focused on survival and maintaining what exists? Is there any sense of vision or focus that allows them to imagine a future? Are there families? Is there someone younger or a heart for the next generation? Are the people tired? I just had a conversation with a church and presented them with 3 or 4 options from we can find a retired pastor to love you guys for a few more years until it really is just absolutely done. We can consider restart. We can consider adoption or planting out of this place. And some of the options they were just too tired to do. And so we had to look at something else and giving them hope, giving them possibilities. But I think you just got to be honest. Most of us can look and see, is discipleship happening? Is evangelism happening? Or are we down to a reflection of worship and fellowship, and that's really it? And it's not fulfilling the mission anymore. It doesn't mean there's not value in what they're doing or what's happening in the way they're taking care of each other, but for the long term, it's just admitting what everybody else knows. It's somebody being willing to say it out loud that we're finished. We're done with this as it is. And we need to do something next and new or different or move on.
I think it's really interesting in that, Tim. I didn't once hear you say make budget or raise funds or anything like that. Those were missional things that you're talking about. And I frequently said that when we prioritize maintenance over mission, we get neither. But if we prioritize mission, then maintenance will take care of itself.
Most churches in this situation think that money's their problem.
Right.
Think that if they had more resources or more volunteers, that they would solve the problem. But that's not the problem. I could dump a year's worth of funding into it, and I'll be in the exact same place a year later. I can send 20 volunteers to help them out, and we're going to be in the exact same place a year later if all of those other things aren't taken care of and solved. And so this restart is a way to really address those hard issues, that vision, that direction, the mission, the purpose, and really just biblically fulfilling what the church is called to be.
So, Dan, what would you say to another pastor, say, who might be listening and is thinking, this church is struggling, and this is a whole new idea to me. I'd never really thought about restarting it. I've tried to revitalize. I've tried all the things that I know to do and all the training that I've been to. This is a new idea. What should I start exploring? What questions should I start asking to see if this is what's right for my church and for me and my ministry?
Yeah. First, I'd say it's not the silver bullet. So it's not going to fix every problem.
Okay.
I get churches that call and they don't need to restart. They need to do something else. But, they hear maybe a success story and think this is going to be the thing that saves them.
Yeah.
So it's not for everybody. But I would say if a pastor's in a church where they've tried it before, and usually churches, the typical church that's a viable restart, they've already tried revitalization 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
That more than likely involved bringing leaders in that didn't work out.
Okay.
Or they might have tried, a consultant or a program, and it just makes them even more discouraged. So they put all these resources and energy and effort into it, and it failed. I remember having conversations with a group here. The church that I came to was named National Memorial Church of God. By the way, it was meant to be the National Cathedral of the Church of God Anderson here in D.C., and I kind of say that lightheartedly because it's a pretty small fish.
Gotcha.
But That was still the vision. Like, we're representing a denomination in DC.
Yeah.
And that vision, you can imagine how many people were excited about that in 2005, 2006. They weren't. At least people on the outside. People on the inside were still excited about that.
Yeah.
The 32 that were here. So I used some of the work from George Bullard, who writes about life cycles. And he describes churches sort of at the end of their life as like a four-wheel drive truck that's stuck in the mud up to the axles. They're spinning, exerting all of this effort and not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And it is exhausting. And that's really the typical church that's ready for a restart. It's the church. They know they've tried everything else, and nothing's worked. And there's a point where you move beyond restart. A restart assumes that you have something to restart, Rob.
Yeah.
If you've lost all of your people and you have two people in the pew, if you've lost all of your resources, your funding, if your building is so far in disrepair that it's really not good for anything anymore, there's a point where, that's when we call the Tims of the world, the district managers, and say, hey, this church doesn't even have enough in the tank left to restart. We're going to have to do something else, a legacy situation.
Right.
But I do want to say, too, to that leader that's listening today, that there is hope. There is hope. And I see it. That's why I love doing this work, because when you see a church that has struggled for decades, finally come to life and start reaching a community, it's not just the community that changes, but there's something about this too. And I call them the remnant group, the group that stays with the church and walks through this radical process. Their lives are changed as well.
Wow.
There's nothing that energizes you is when you start seeing baptisms and people come to Christ. It just charges you up. I tell people it's like a drug addiction. Once you see it once or twice, you just want more of that in your church.
Yeah. So by the same token then, Tim, what if someone's listening today and says, look, I'm not a pastor, but I know that my pastor needs to be hearing this, and I've been trying to get other people in my congregation to get this. What would you say to them? How can they get their pastor or even their district superintendent on board to this idea?
Do I have to answer that question?
Yes, you do.
I don't know that I have a really great answer, other than this is when you start praying, and starting conversations. And if you have a relationship with your pastor or a leader, then there are books that begin having conversations around this to see where it's possible. That's where you find hope, whether it's Dan's book, Dying to Restart. There's another one, I think it's called Glory Revealed, that it's just very open about the pluses and minuses of this kind of approach. Or, my book, Rethinking Church, tells our story. And those are places that you begin to engender hope. So you get a couple of people imagining, praying, dreaming for the future of the church and for God's will to be done in that place, and begin to explore this as an option. And if you can't get away from it, then it's something to lean into. But if you're as a lay person, as someone who maybe doesn't have the authority to really push some of these things, prayer and conversations. I heard about this thing, and I know how much we love the church, and maybe we could have a conversation. You can always reach out to those people who have done the work, and just let them talk with you and listen. Begin to have some conversations first with God, and then with the pastor, and then together with the district or denominational leader. A lay person, probably, I would just say, don't skip past your pastor to the district. You're not going to get anywhere that way. But the pastor, beginning to have that conversation, the pastor, let's be honest, the pastor's as beaten down and frustrated as anybody.
Right.
And when we are leading one of these churches that need to restart, we feel like a failure. We worked at Revitalization for a year before we made the decision, and I was ready to give up. until we just felt like God gave us this route to try. And I didn't have any more assurance that it was going to work than anything else, but it wasn't going to be any worse than what we were doing.
Yeah.
And, beginning to have hope and beginning to have some courage again, and this sense that God has called us. And if God has called us, we can do whatever he asks us to do. And success or failure is up to him. But that hope has to be reborn, and the possibility has to be discovered. And I think as you can have those conversations, first with God, then with the pastor, and then beyond from there.
Wow. That's helpful to remember that, to realize that there may be a sense of failure that the pastor is feeling along the way, or the congregation, or the people who have grown up in that church or have a long legacy there, that there may be a sense of failure, but there's a sense of hope even beyond the difficult things that need to happen there. So, Tim, I wonder, you both talked about this a little bit, but first I want to go to you, Tim. Can you give us a story of something that happened, maybe something that you have done yourself, or that you've seen another place where a church restart has gone well and flourished?
Right now, we actually have a couple of restarts happening in Alabama that I'm excited about. Both of these guys, very different from each other in personality, in age, and in their church situations. But we've got a church in Prattville, just a remarkable town, about 50,000. The church is on the main drag, but was invisible. It had been there so long.
In one of the fastest growing communities in Alabama, too.
Yeah, absolutely. A really fast growing area, a lot of potential. And the pastor there had dealt with a lot of heartache and struggled right from the beginning, and knew it was going to be a challenge, and even had to challenge some leadership and some ways of thinking in that culture to bring them to a place of being open to restarting. But the pastor there, he did his work ahead of time in preparing the people, praying with the people, introducing it. I think he spent about 18 months leading up to the shutdown. And when I came as the district leader to actually disorganize the existing church to be able to launch the new one, when I pronounced the church disorganized, there was applause. I've never seen that. It is, I get scowls, I get disappointment, I get tears, never applause. But they were so excited for what's next. And so they relaunched in October, and they are going to 2 services on Easter because they have been overfilling their space several times, and it's then dropped back down. So they're taking the next step, have added some part-time staff to the team, and just have some great momentum as they reach out. And they didn't spend a ton of money doing it. Did some simple priority things, but got people excited and involved, and then made some changes that brought attention from the community. They take care of guests well, and it's given them the opportunity to make a difference and begin to make some new disciples there in that community.
Wow. Applause, recognizing that the hard thing is happening, and now we can move on to new things. How about you, Dan, either from your own pastoral experience or some of these churches that you're aware of through research or through coaching?
Oh, this is hard to pick. Hard to pick, Rob. I want to share 2 examples, and they're very different sorts of restarts. So let me talk about a church in Fredericksburg, Virginia, that's called the Bridge. The Bridge is about 2 years old, and strangely enough, the Bridge was restarted through an adoption restart, and so it was adopted by a church in Nashville, Tennessee. And their connection was through their denomination, Free Will Baptist, I guess it is. So Tommy Swindoll, that pastors the Donaldson Fellowship in Nashville, just has a heart for church planting and multiplication. He never thought he would be in the space of helping restart churches, but he started getting calls out of the blue, one from Fredericksburg, and now I'm working with another one from Ypsilanti. But let me stay on Fredericksburg for a moment. So that church, again, was about 25 to 30, and the Pastor Chris, kept telling me, Dan, we're at the end of a dead-end street, man. I just don't see us really attracting people. And When I went down there, I realized that was absolutely true. I couldn't even find the church, and I was trying to.
Oh, wow.
They ended up, and boy, talk about a moment of God. Tommy came down from the church in Nashville. I was there, Chris was there, and we had sort of that come to Jesus moment with this small group of people where Tommy just shared his heart about why they were doing this, why they wanted to come alongside them and help them through this season. I sort of shared some hope and other stories that it's possible. And then Chris is just a really good shepherd and loves people really well. So they said yes to it. I don't know that they knew where this was going to lead, but the church sold that property, moved into a middle school or elementary school gymnasium. And I probably more than half of the people left that were there in the beginning. But just a couple of Sundays ago, 180 people were gathered there to celebrate their second anniversary.
Oh, wow.
Just a huge, huge turnaround from what it was. But, okay, on the other end of the spectrum, this little church in Tyler, Texas, this was a Church of God Anderson, the same denomination that I'm in. And Tyler was a little church of about 20, 25. And I went down, and sometimes I'll go in for a weekend consultation. This is when I did go in and spend time with them. And they were just tired. An older group in the middle of like the area you described a moment ago, a thriving area of Tyler, Texas,
Right.
high-end area of Tyler, Texas. And little church that just could not get traction. And long story short, so we walked with that church through it was about 18-month restart process, and oh my goodness, they just opened and then COVID hit. I feel for these leaders that they go through all of this work, and there's so many church planners I've heard that same story with, and that was their story. They launched, COVID hit. They were in Texas, so they opened up a lot quicker than we did in DC, so that was helpful. But this church just gave it everything they could give it, doing all sorts of events in the neighborhood. And in that case, Rob, and I see this a lot of times, there's a demographic shift that's happened in a neighborhood.
Okay.
And in their case, it was second and third generation Latinos were largely the neighbors.
Yeah.
And the folks that had settled into that church for decades were Anglos that were driving in, 30, 40 minutes from outside of the city.
Right.
So, yeah, that pastor, it quickly grew to 50, 60 people, dynamic, young, second, third generation Latinos that were just digging in, doing ministry, inviting their friends. I mean, that's what gets my blood pumping when you see that level of change happen, and the neighbors ride by and want to know why they have a new name and what's going on in this place. And so neighbors are attracted to what's happening there.
And all of these stories that you've been telling, in particular these here, I hear a common thread of a better reflection of the kingdom of God in your own community, as opposed to, just kind of what was there, or maybe the community shifting around you, but to better engage with them. Wow, you all both give me a great deal of hope for what could be, and also hope for those my friends and others who have been going through some really tough things. So, Dan, would you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to share some statistics.
Please.
This is a pretty relatively new phenomenon in the last couple of decades at least. Is probably the first time we start seeing it happen, but it's growing. And so there's a book that just came out called Restart Churches. Penfold and Taylor are the authors. So they studied 45 Restart churches. It's the largest sample size. I've done some of this research, but much smaller sample sizes. And I want to share just their major findings.
Brilliant.
Out of those 45 churches, one of them failed, but the other 44 made it.
Wow.
And of the 45 churches, 97% said that it was successful or somewhat successful. And those churches, you relaunch with different amounts of people, but the average growth for those 45 churches was 271% growth for those that started under 50. And for churches that were between 50 to 100 when they relaunched, their average growth was 137%.
Oh, my goodness.
So and I was talking to a denomination leader recently, there's very few programs that you see that level of change happen that drastically. So, I just want to celebrate that God is doing something really special here when a church is willing to do the ultimate and lay down their life for Jesus and for the sake of the gospel so that they can find new life. There's something really special that happens in these resurrection moments.
Wow, I think that's a beautiful place to kind of wrap that up because, there is hope even through all of this, and knowing that God is much more interested and invested in this work than even we are. And to follow that pattern of reaching out to others, as you've pointed out so beautifully, is very, very encouraging. Tim, if people wanted to learn more or to get in touch with you, your book, how would they do so?
You can find me online, timfox.online. There you can find access to the book, a few podcast episodes and teachings that we have out there and things like that. And then there's links to the book on Amazon or Wesleyan Publishing House, and it's a great way to reach out. I still do occasional coaching and training and consulting with churches as I'm able to, but primarily be able to just be a source of encouragement and pointing in the directions of those who can help most. But yep, that's how you can get in touch with me, where you can find a little more information about the book and connect.
Perfect, thanks. And Dan?
Yeah, you can find information at Dying to Restart, and it's 2 is the number 2, dyingtorestart.org, and link for the book and how to get in touch with me there. Starting some exciting conversations about developing a center, a multi-denominational center for Church Restart.
Oh, wow.
The need is enormous, and so I'm finding God just keeps opening some doors in this area. So stay tuned there, but you can find information about that as well at dyingtorestart.org.
Perfect. Well, Dan, Tim, thank you so much for being on the Real Faith, Real World podcast and being such a hope to many of us as we're looking for ways to reach our communities for the sake of the gospel.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, brother.
I think it's so important to make sure that we don't villainize the people who try to keep their churches open, but instead encourage them, whatever they may be going through, listening to the Spirit of God, trying to figure out how to best serve their communities and be faithful to God's call wherever they may be. I hope that you found this encouraging and hopeful today, whether you're going through a church restart or trying to bring deep change into your church, just as Dan and Tim reminded us. Go ahead and rate and subscribe right now. I know that you will not want to miss any of these episodes in this series on Innovating Church. We've had some fascinating conversations, and today was certainly one of them. Also, if you're interested in leadership in these innovative ways and you live in Europe, it's time for you to register for Metanoia Europe 2022. This will be August the 29th through September the 4th. It will be in Durham, England. And we're focusing on people 18 to 35 who are serving in ministry, whether they be ordained or lay people. You can visit our website, worldmethodist.org, to learn more, to register, or to support someone who would like to go. We'd also love to hear from you with your comments, your questions, or your suggestions for future episodes. You can contact us at podcast@worldmethodist.org. Of course, everything that Tim and Dan mentioned today will be in the show notes, and there you will also find all of our social media connections for the show and my personal ones as well. Let us hear from you. Well, thanks again to Dan and Tim. Thank you to the folks at Christ Church Memphis for their sponsorship of this episode, and my thanks to you for listening. I'm Rob Haynes, and this is WME's Real Faith, Real World.